Hello everyone, and we're back for chapter 18. The last session was chapter 17 of 1st Samuel in the 1st Samuel series. And 1st Samuel, so far we've seen David has finally come into the scene with the first major battle with the Philistines, and of course their champion Goliath, being their hero or their hope, is killed by David with one shot of the sling, and his own sword slays him. I want to say, or rather, I want to give a translation from the King James Version, which says, out of chapter 17, verse 51, which of course is our highlight verse, that therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, this Goliath, and took his sword and slew it out of the sheath, and drew it out of the sheath, thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. So this is that scene in the movie, the one that defines, it's like the highlight, the scene of all scenes, the one that, you know, if they want to do a little clip or a preview, they will almost want to show you that one. So this is our great scene of chapter 17, which ushers in David into the series, into 1st Samuel. And I'll read it again. Therefore David ran and stood up upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And then the Philistines saw their and when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. You want to look at that version because it's intriguing that just felling Goliath with a sling wasn't enough. David was not going to settle at the fact that Goliath was on the ground flat, with all his 9 feet or 3 meters worth of height on the ground. That was just step one. And he stood upon him. And first of all, he ran. Okay, let's not skip that bit, because it's important that he ran. He didn't just walk over, in sort of a hungry, tired looking way. He was excited about this, finishing off the business. Come on, let's finish up the business. It wasn't enough. The battle isn't over yet until Goliath is dead. So not only does he run, he stands upon him, takes his sword. Whose sword? Goliath's sword, and draws it out of the sheath thereof, and slays him, and cuts off his head with it. Like, imagine if the point of the spear, the metal side of it, it said it weighed about 6.9 kilograms. How about his sword? How much did that weigh? And David had the strength to wield it, maneuver with it, and cut off a 9-foot man's head. I don't even know what that was like, that he did it. And that was a defining moment. The beheading of Goliath. That was his trophy. David's trophy was the head of Goliath, the enemy of the Lord, because he had defied the Lord himself by defying the armies of the Lord. Of course, when the Philistines saw it, they fled. And the war was as good as done, because the Israelite armies took over and they pursued the Philistines and won the battle, and then came back for the plunder in the camp of the Philistines. So now, chapter 18, we saw also in chapter 17 that David gets a formal introduction to Saul, and Saul or rather gets to formally introduce himself to Saul, and he gets to tell him who he was. So in verse 18 now that Saul has met David, and it is clear that David is the man of the moment, he has saved the day. I'm going to read right through chapter 18 very quickly. And this is of the NIV version. Hopefully I can do that in a first. So this is David, our anointed king. Remember, he was anointed in chapter 16. And we haven't seen him until in chapter 17 in action. So let's see now. He has now gotten into action. He has proven himself. It is clear that God was not just choosing anybody. He knew the kind of product or stuff that David was made of. And he has proven himself. So chapter 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, remember this is the introduction that formal introduction that he makes to Saul, and he has just introduced himself as, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem, because Saul had asked him, whose son are you, young man? Now, why was that so important? Lineage, well, is quite something, and we'll see it in a couple of chapters probably when we get to see the lineages and why it was so important for Saul to know, whose son are you? Okay. So in chapter 18, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. Wow. Look at that. And he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And David and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with tambourines and lyres. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. And Saul said to David, Here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. But David said to Saul, Who am I? And what is my family or my clan in Israel? that I should become the king's son-in-law. So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. Then Saul ordered his attendants, speak to David privately, and say, look, the king likes you, and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law. They repeated these words to David, but David said, do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. When Saul's servant told him what David had said, Saul replied, say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David took his men with him and went out and killed 200 Philistines and brought back their foreskins. They counted out the full number to the king so that David might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. So we see here the rise of David as a commander out of a plot to kill him. Sometimes it's the very things that are made to destroy us that make us even more popular and even more renowned. Who thought that really David would be joining the army of Saul? A shepherd boy. A shepherd boy. And now he was serving the king not just as the player of a lyre, as we saw earlier in chapter 16, but now in chapter 18 he has been given a battalion, 1,000-man force to lead in battle. And sparked by anger, Saul himself sets him up for success, unknowingly, unknown to him that his plan to destroy David actually becomes the very catalyst for him to become even more powerful. And the chapter, of course, begins with a very interesting thing here, which we know can be a political suicide. But the ladies, really, they were just singing. I mean, we can't blame them. And they were stating the truth that Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, which was a fact. But as the king, we saw that Saul was already a very insecure man, and we saw how he treated Jonathan. And speaking of Jonathan, well, we saw how he treated Jonathan in chapter 15 and 16 when his leadership was shaky. And albeit even the troops were glad that there was a man of faith who believed in the Lord. Remember, the Spirit of the Lord has left Saul, and he was empty inside. He was really a walking vacuum. Well, empty, really. He was not himself. He was not fulfilled. He was battling from within and without. And when we're battling inside, we can only lose the battles that are without. Can't win the battles that come at us from outside when we are not settled in the battles within ourselves. And he had lost the place and the position that God had given him. He had lost his position spiritually. It was only a matter of time that this begins to manifest in the physical realm because he was shattered and broken inside. He is a man who was using his children, his daughters, in his plot to kill somebody in his schemes and giving them off like chattel. And we saw this used to happen. It was culture, but he didn't care whether Mareb, his daughter, loved David or not. He just gives her away without consulting her or anything. And it's like, give her over. Let her be the reward, or let her be the bait, the poison. That she was supposed to trouble him. She was supposed to trouble David and become a snare, a trap. This is a deceptive man. He was becoming a deceiving man, a wicked man. Jonathan had his own story with his father. Remember that Saul wanted to kill him? Saul, his own father, wanted to kill Jonathan because of an oath he had made about the armies not having food the whole day, and Jonathan had gone out to battle, and he had gone out to the Philistine camp to instigate and to start a battle, and he was out killing the enemy of his father. But when he came back, he was told, hey, you're not supposed to eat anything, and he just taken a scoop of honey, and his father was ready to kill him for that. His father was willing to kill him for that. So Jonathan, we're not told where he was during the Philistine behest or confrontation, but when he meets David, the two become as one. It's interesting. It says that he loved David as himself in verse 1. And from that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Whoa, he made a covenant. Do you know a covenant? A covenant is like a marriage covenant, covenant. Those are the things you don't break. He made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Now there was nothing political here. It doesn't say that there was any deceit or underhandedness. No conniving, no backstabbing here. He just loved David. So he gave him his tunic. He gave him his robe that he was wearing as a sign of authority. He was passing on a level of authority to him. It was not just saying, I love you, I as myself. It was almost like you can end up being royalty like me, like we are one, we are at the same level, you're my brother, we are at par. He gave it to David, and his tunic, even his sword, his weapon, his bow and his belt. Now if you wanna know that this was complete loyalty, it's the personal effects, it's the level of how personal these gifts were to Jonathan, and he was willing to give them away. I don't know, I think the men are still men as they were then, but giving away your sword, you are defined by your sword. If you are a warrior, you are defined by your sword. As the son of a king, as the king's son, he was defined by his robes. So he really was sharing everything with him because his soul already belonged to David. So it's no surprise that he shares more than just his heart. He gives over not just his heart, but also the physical effects that come with him as a person, his identity, his authority, even his bow and his belt, his identity. He was sharing that with David. A covenant is a serious thing. And so that it's interesting that the two are like kindred spirit. And we saw that Jonathan also was a mighty warrior. And like David, he wanted to see Israel succeeding. And he couldn't understand why they were not, why they were not fighting like the stories of old where there was victory because God was with them. He chose, like David, to fight his battles in the name of the Lord. He trusted God. So it is no surprise that these two valiant men become so close that they have a covenant. And in exchange, as a sign of that covenant, they exchange. And Jonathan gives David these things because he loved him. Did David love him as much? We are not told. But if they made a covenant, then perhaps he did. Sounds a bit dangerous, almost like eerie, or like, wow, that's a bit too much, don't you think? So anyway, as far as this chapter is concerned, that's all we get to hear about Jonathan, that they were now kindred spirit, they were one. And the way it's described, that Jonathan became one in spirit with David. So now, back to Saul. He starts to make all these plans. The first plan, first of all, we see that he's really upset about the refrain that David has his tens of thousands. Well, only 1,000, or only thousands were attributed to him. And from that time, he kept a close eye on David, because he said to himself, what more can he get but the kingdom? You see, Saul understood the power of this song. And even today, the music we hear tells us a lot about what people are thinking and who they're endorsing, and what sways them, or what moves them, and what has their emotions. And right now, the people's hearts were with David, and that made Saul's heart melt with fear. And so he keeps a close eye on him. And as any other secular political figure, he wants to keep his power. He wants to keep his territory. He wants to keep his kingdom. He's desperate to do so. And he's so afraid of David because he knows the hearts of his people are with him. Because the Lord was with him was another reason. And it was clear to Saul that the Lord had departed from him. So he sent David away and gave him command of 1,000. And what was his reasoning? That as the troops went for their campaigns against the Philistines would kill him. And when he saw how successful David was, even in those campaigns, he was afraid of him. But Israel, in chapter 16, says, but Israel, in verse 16, that Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Yep. So now, that giving him over as a leader, or rather placing him or appointing him, and sometimes we are appointed for the wrong reasons. Sometimes we get our titles and positions because somebody wants to kill us with that title. You need to know that when the Lord is on your side, you will survive that scheme of the enemy, or from the enemy. Saul said to David, here is my oldest son, daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to me, Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. So when that doesn't work, he gives the hand of his daughter over to David for marriage. And that doesn't work either, because David asks himself, who am I? Who am I? And we see that he actually feared that position. He saw it as a post, as a seat, as not just being a son-in-law, but a very powerful and seat of responsibility. It was an office to him, an office of being son-in-law. So when the time came for Saul's daughter to be given to David, he was not for it. So she was given to somebody else called Adriel. Now Saul's daughter Michal is one who was in love with David. Isn't that interesting? And she wasn't considered, but now she was considered. Why? Because Saul's idea of a marriage was so that he could have some influence and deceitful influence over David. It was a wicked influence. So he said to himself, I will give her to him, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Because the Philistines were going to be against anybody who was related to Saul. Now, what happens then is that he gives bride price of 100 foreskins. Now, notice that Saul ordered his attendants to speak to David on the side. Doesn't that happen when you know that you're going to be spoken to by so and so, but really they've been sent to you? And he tried to manipulate this scenario to such great extent. He orders his servants to do what he wasn't willing to do himself because he was such a coward. He wanted someone else to convince David. And he was using his power really wrongfully, because it wasn't the work of the servants to set up this marriage for Saul, but because the intent was already wrong and the motive was wrong, even the means was tainted. So David asked, do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm a poor man. And that is what gives away David's problem. He was poor and little known. And Saul says, okay, very well, I will solve that for you. Just give me 100 foreskins. I don't need money. I don't need wealth. And that sounds good to David, because he is going to be fighting the enemies of God any day. And he said, David said that he would do that. He agreed to it. 100 foreskins. And Saul told him to take revenge of my enemies. To take revenge on his enemies. Yeah. Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of Philistines. It's a manipulator. There's a wickedness coming in as well, and deceitfulness, because David trusted Saul. He honestly did not think that Saul would be fighting him, but pride got in the way. Pride and insecurity and fear and suspicion. But at the end of it all, it's because the Spirit of God had left him. And he knew that the Lord was with David, and that scared him. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased and become the king's son-in-law. And guess what? He delivered. And they counted them out. I just imagine having to count out. Anyway, they counted out the full number. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal. And of course, Michal was really happy about that, I'm sure, I bet. Not realizing that she had just been given off to marriage to fulfill a more grand master plan of keeping David's influence down and even possibly getting him killed. That was the plan, actually. Saul just wanted David killed, and he was going to give over his own daughter to marriage, knowing that she may lose her husband. That was not a problem to him. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid. The very tactic, the very strategy that was supposed to make him more secure made him even more afraid. And the Lord will do that. When people know that the Lord is with us, they get upset. But you know what? They also get afraid. Because he just kept gaining favor. He had Michal's favor now. His family was all sold out to David. Jonathan loved him. Michal loved him. The people of his kingdom loved him. And he was defeating the Philistines. He was a successful man in his battles, in his campaigns. So Saul, out of jealousy, and also because he was afraid he was losing this battle for his kingdom, he remained the enemy of David for the rest of his life. The Philistine commanders, however, continued to go to battle as often as they did. And of course, the more times they went to battle, David got a chance to show himself as a mighty man of war and the soldier that he was, a skilled soldier and a successful leader. And he got to prove himself over and over again. And David met more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. So despite everything that Saul planned against David, because the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, despite all the ways he tried to get around getting rid of David and destroying him and his career, it didn't work. The Lord did not allow it to work because he was with David. So let's be encouraged. When God is with us, who can be against us? See you with the next chapter as we move on to chapter 19 next.